school in London. And I got there, and in my first week, I had two experiences that would profoundly influence my own sense of purpose over the next 25 years. And the first was that Amnesty International were doing a letter-writing campaign encouraging an arms embargo against Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, this was 2001, so plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. And I remember going along. I was incensed when this was advertised in the school assembly, and I went to write my own postcard congratulating the relevant minister on the close trading relationship between Israel and the UK. We needed to support our key ally, the only democracy in the Middle East. I handed this in, and the sixth form girl who was running the club said to me, "We can't send this." And I asked why. She pointed to the board and said, "You need to copy the text." Now, in fairness to Amnesty, I suppose their shtick has always been to send identical postcards, but I thought this was ridiculous. I started challenging her on the text on the board. She didn't know up from down on the subject. And then the second incident that really cemented this for me was 2 days later, the sixth form were having a debate. This house resents Israel's policy in Palestine. And when, as an upper third, I think this was unprecedented, I proffered my own views from the floor that there was a problem with the motion because there'd never been any such thing as a state of Palestine, and therefore, while there was a Palestinian Authority, it might one day become a state. That would depend on all sorts of factors. The motion was inherently problematic. Again, sort of blank stares came back towards me, and I spent the next few years, especially up until the Lebanon War in 2006, arguing mostly with my teachers. And I promise I was a very good girl at school. I would never have dreamt of arguing with my teachers generally, but on this subject, I knew that they were so wrong. And I think part of that knowledge or belief in the inaccuracy of what they were saying was predicated on my own experiences going to Israel, growing up. I come from 8 generations in the land of Israel, and so I always had, I think, quite a deep appreciation of the history of that country, but also an appreciation of the day-to-day, and I knew what they were saying was incorrect. So it was that weekend, that first weekend of big school, that I took stock, and I thought, this is what I have to do. I need to get smart on the subject. I need to embrace debating. Happily, I already love to argue. And I have to say that I feel so tremendously blessed to have had this sense of purpose. Because when I look around at, friends from school or university or even colleagues from the workplace, I can see that they have, work, career, maybe they're in a settled relationship or they're on these blasted apps, and they've got the gym and the pub, and that's life. And I have had this incredible sense of purpose that is far bigger than me, that gives me energy and gets me up every morning and gives me energy, I would say, whereas, the day job takes energy away from me. This is something that I've always found energizing to do. So it's a little awkward and extremely humbling, but yes, awkward to hear all of these nice things being said about me for doing something that I've always felt is absolutely a sense of purpose and a duty. I've never felt I had a choice in the matter, but to the extent that I'm able to have a little bit of impact and try and give people the tools to push back on some of these major misrepresentations that we're seeing day in, day out, it is also a real privilege to do so.
Brilliant answer. So the week has already started with difficulty with the Hatzola bus ambulances. Obviously, last week we heard that this very centre was being looked at by possible Iranian spies. We are in such a bad place at the moment, it feels like, in this country, but also in other countries. It seems to me that we need the political will to do something, but we need them to use the law, and the law isn't helping us. For example, today I was being asked on the TV about the Bob Dylan chant, and that's a kind of, because the CPS said that death, the IDF, there's nothing wrong with it. So then it's repeated and repeated. So how could the law be used better to protect us?
I I think it was November 2023 that the Free Speech Union organised a panel on policing protests in light of what we had seen. I mean, Bob Villan's death to the IDF is perhaps a more recent manifestation of it, but for 2.5 years, more or less, we have had people on the streets of London and other cities across the UK on a weekly basis calling for mass murder. Globalise the Intifada. I mean, we all know what that means. From the river to the sea. We all know what that means. And you don't even need to go to the Arabic translation that continues, from the river to the sea, the land will be Arab. The free Palestine that has been called for so consistently, well, since the formation of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization in the 1960s, was for it to be free of Jews. So that's always, I think, been very clear to us. But the real difficulty that I encountered in the context of this panel really early on was how much of a disconnect we were experiencing when it came to law enforcement, when it came to the politicians and the broader public. I was extremely encouraged, though, because on this panel with me were Sir Ken MacDonald and forgive me, now Lord MacDonald, of course, or it's been a long day, ladies and gentlemen. You'll have to forgive me if I'm muddling people's titles up.
You might need to explain who he is.
Well, former Attorney General, and Sir Jonathan Hall, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. And I was really delighted is a strong word, but encouraged to see that they both agreed with me that the police had the powers to be policing these protests properly and to be arresting people for public order offences and inciting racial hatred in the way that we know that these slogans are and have been, as they've been continuously used. I think the proof of that particular pudding came, and devastating that it had to come both after the Manchester synagogue Yom Kippur attack and also the Bondi Beach attack, with a number of police forces turning around and saying, well, actually, we will be seeking to arrest and prosecute when people are using these phrases to promote racial hatred. Now, as far as I'm concerned, and I follow this pretty closely, there have been no changes in the law, no changes in the police powers between the 2 years of this behaviour being continuously allowed on the streets of the United Kingdom, and then this decision to actually take it seriously and to do something about it. And so, in a long-winded way, forgive me, to answer your question, it's not that the law needs changing here. In most aspects of the difficulties that we are facing, that we are encountering, the law as it exists just needs to be applied. And ultimately, I think it is a question as to whether the political will is there or not. And ultimately, I mean, the elephant in the room, why is it so hard for successive generations of politicians to take these threats seriously? Is it because of a fear of the consequences? And then what are those consequences? Is it potentially being called racist? Is it losing significant demographics of your target constituencies in elections? Is it other political influences that have been growing in this country, including with changing demographics? And it's only through the sort of open debate, which of course has in the last week been unceremoniously shut down, with the shadow justice minister being, threatened with consequences for exercising his powers of analysis and free speech on this subject. Of course, I'm talking about Nick Timothy MP. We can see the consequences of even raising some of these very problematic questions as to why more action isn't being taken. And I think that's an extremely dangerous consequence of, where society, our society in particular, seems to be moving in this regard.
It's amazing, though, isn't it? We have had 2 people killed in Manchester. I know that there was a lot of, I think the public really saw saw yesterday as for what it was, and yet the political will isn't there. How do we change things?
Pressure, is all I can say. And, some of that is within your hands, ladies and gentlemen, writing to your MP, advocating, even if it's on social media, writing the kind of op-eds that this remarkable lady next to me has been continuously leading the way on. Nicole, I was a fan of yours before 7th of October because of your incredible work on Jeremy Corbyn, but since then I think you have just been such a tremendously brave force for reason, and that sort of leadership is critical because I think it leaves a lot of us thinking, I'm not the only one, for sure, or I'm not crazy. But I think it's also extremely empowering, and it's that empowerment to pick up that baton. I suppose to embrace that sense of purpose that I felt at 11, and to recognize that change is only going to come from us. There is no one else fighting our corner, I'm afraid to say. And so some of it is shaming those that have allowed and enabled this to happen and demanding better of them. Often that's going to be with respect to the politicians. But there are, I think, so many other aspects of, complaints to the BBC, complaints to healthcare regulators, ultimately an awful lot that UK Lawyers for Israel is engaged in on a daily basis. 7 days a week, unfortunately. I mean, we've seen an over 20% increase in the level of work that is sort of coming in the door. We're quite heavily reliant on volunteers, but we've also been able to increase our staff capacity to try and grapple with this. And an awful lot of the successes that we're seeing are on holding people, authorities to account and demanding the proper application of the law. And the more people that pick up arms on this, the bigger the army that we can have in fighting this fight, I think that the more likely we are to succeed. And ultimately, I don't believe that we have a choice but to pick up that baton.
Absolutely. So I've seen some amazing letters written by UKLFI, and I've worked closely with them on some stories. But what would you say are some of your big wins that you're proudest of?
I know it sounds very English to write letters. And actually, when I speak about what UK Lawyers for Israel is doing in America, the general kind of puzzling look that I get in response is, why don't you just sue the bastards? And the answer to that is, frankly, we have found letters to be enormously effective at ensuring that the law is upheld and applied. This is from assisting students on campus and providing them with the support when they are either engaging with university authorities or with student unions. And we've shut down many student union anti-Israel BDS resolutions, which are just entirely inconsistent with the charitable objects and the purposes of these student unions. Likewise, with respect to local authorities, who are continuously, it seems, seeking to pass anti-Israel BDS resolutions, divestment resolutions from various pensions funds. We've had enormous success at holding those authorities to account because it is, in many cases, a breach of fiduciary duty with respect to those sorts of investments where your primary obligation is to increase, obviously the value of that investment, and where there is specific guidance from the Law Commission to avoid controversial issues. So it's been extremely effective in that regard. I'd also highlight, just this last week, the recent FIFA decision, which some of you may have come across. I'd say that the consistent efforts of UK Lawyers for Israel with respect to FIFA have been successful from 2016, when the Palestinian Football Association first tried to get Israel suspended from FIFA for organising football leagues in what they called, falsely, incorrectly, occupied territory. So we successfully defeated that attempt in 2017. There was an appeal, and I believe in 2018 that was rejected. So in 2024, they tried again with the renewed wind behind their sails of, everything that has happened since the 7th of October. And I think, they felt the changing tide against Israel in terms of public opinion. Well, earlier this week, FIFA announced again that it was not going to suspend Israel on this basis. And I believe a substantial reason for that was the very detailed legal submissions from UK lawyers for Israel on public international law and what the status of the disputed territories is, and highlighting the many other parts of the world in which football leagues are organised in disputed territories. And this wasn't an issue that FIFA wanted to get anywhere near. Not least, of course, one aspect of what we raised were the very racist policies of the Palestinian Football Association that doesn't permit Jews to play, or women, I think, for that matter, and the very problematic position that Jabril Rajoub, who heads up the Palestinian Football Association, takes. So that latest example with respect to FIFA is reflective of so many successes that we have across sporting federations. I mean, everything from badminton to judo, karate to bowls. Did you know that there was an international bowls championship? Well, they didn't want the Israeli team to participate, and it was being held in the south of England. And after our intervention and mostly these representations are to do with anti-discrimination provisions in the constitutions of the very sporting federations that are hosting these competitions. There was a U-turn. And so we see that consistently across sporting federations. There was a lot of work, of course, that went into the anti-BDS legislation here, which unfortunately was killed when Rishi Sunak called the election. But I think it highlighted a very important fact or factor that foreign policy, i.e., the policy towards Israel, is a matter for Westminster, is a matter for the national government, not for the devolved powers. So the theme that I would draw out of all of these examples is about seeking the proper upholding of the law. And then the other track is about education. And my focus, especially in the last sort of 6-7 years, has been education on international law, because ultimately this is the mechanism by which Israel is now consistently demonized, delegitimized, and where misinformation is being spread. You will hear people saying that this, that, and the other that Israel is doing is contrary to international law. May I encourage you, the next time you find yourself in a conversation with someone next to the water cooler, or in one of these posh dinner parties that I hear are still ongoing, even though I'm not invited anymore, may I encourage you to ask this, whichever individual is that proffers this nugget to you, when they say Israel's in violation of international law, ask them which law. Because invariably they will not be able to tell you. Because Israel is a country of law and order. It is a country that upholds the rule of law. And it is a country that, like no other when it goes to war, sets a standard that I think any other country would struggle to uphold, which goes way above the requirements of international law and the laws of armed conflict. And I have seen that, all the way through, when I first really started to engage with the subject of the law of armed conflict from 2014 and Israel's war against Gaza during Tzuk Eitan, Protective Edge, up to, the last few days, where the manner in which Israel conducts armed conflict is so highly regulated by lawyers. You'll know that the lawyers per capita in Israel are off the scale. But the lawyers per capita in the army are equally unparalleled in any other modern law-abiding moral army. And that the effect of that is really palpable in terms of the checks and balances and the legal processes and targeting and analysis and proportionality balancing that gets undertaken throughout these processes. So a lot of what we're focusing on now in educating on what real international law is also about holding to account those organizations and individuals that are lying about international law, be that Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Commission of Inquiry at the UN Human Rights Council, certain UN special rapporteurs like Francesca Albanese, who was only yesterday, again, speaking at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. So all of these individuals, not to speak of certain TV personalities that should have the book thrown at them, but all of this really, I think, is important to educating the broader public on what real international law says about these issues.
So can we talk a bit about international law and Iran, and if someone says it shouldn't be, we're not allowed to go to war, then what's the kind of easy answer?
Apologies for anyone who has been sort of following what I've been doing on the media the last few weeks. I feel a bit like a broken record, but every time I speak about this, people tell me, I've never heard that before, so I feel it bears repeating. This chorus that we've heard, that the strikes by Israel and the US are illegal on Iran, is absolutely bonkers. And frankly, I think it's also dangerous because it is so misrepresentative of what international law says. It is ultimately going to make it impossible for Western liberal democratic law-abiding states to seek to defend themselves in future. I mean, this will no doubt have palpable effects going forward. And if it's not that, then it's just discrediting the international legal system as a whole, which is also dangerous and I think lamentable for any of us that actually care about international law, real international law. So the first thing to know is that there has been an ongoing armed conflict between Israel and Iran for decades. Now, that has manifested itself clearly with Iranian proxies attacking Israel, but it's also seen direct strikes by Iran onto Israeli civilians, right? Not just indirectly through Hamas, Hezbollah, and other proxies in Iraq and in Syria, but Iran struck Israel directly. So in the context of an ongoing armed conflict, none of this analysis, which sometimes you hear on some of the media about a resort to force, none of that is relevant. In an armed conflict, you can hit military targets as long as you comply with the laws of armed conflict, namely distinction. You distinguish between civilians and combatants on the battlefield. Military necessity, so you are taking action that is necessary to advance your military aims. Proportionality, which is perhaps the most misrepresented aspect of international law, full stop. Proportionality is not about weighing up casualty figures on both sides of a conflict. I mean, that's macabre. But if you think about it logically, it would also simply encourage further Hamas's use of human shields. Proportionality is about weighing up the anticipated military advantage of a strike against the expected civilian or collateral damage. And the key thing to know in the context of armed conflict is that civilians will die. It is a tragic inevitability. The whole process of, abiding by the laws of armed conflict is to seek to minimize the number of civilian casualties and collateral damage as much as possible. And that feeds into the fourth principle, which is that of precaution. You're supposed to take whatever precautions are reasonable in the context of that military action to minimize those civilian casualties. And so long as you are complying with distinction, military necessity, proportionality, and precaution, then the strikes that you undertake are legal. And that is as far as the debate needs to go with respect to Israel and Iran. With respect to the United States, well, the US is assisting its ally in that self-defense. And that is consistent with international law on individual and collective self-defense. That is not self-defense is not a right that is bestowed on any state in international law. It's in fact an inherent right, sometimes referred to as a God-given right. It's one that is recognized in international law, in particular Article 51 of the UN Charter. And so America's justifications for these strikes begin with Israel's ongoing armed conflict, but they continue. There are multiple layers. We have heard President Trump, at the announcement of this military action, referring to Iran's activities against America and American national interests. And everything from the 1979 American hostage crisis to the hundreds of US service personnel that have been killed by the Iranians, through to the continuing threats by Iran against American interests. And then on top of that, you've got what we've heard in terms of this discussion of imminent threats that require preemptive strikes. That is, if you will, an additional layer of justification, which is inevitably more controversial because it requires relying on intelligence that, Iran's progress to nuclear weapons was so significant that it constitutes an imminent threat that the United States had to deal with. There is intelligence that has been made available on that. Steve Witkoff talking about the Iranian boast in the negotiations that they basically had sufficient nuclear material for 11 nuclear weapons, and so that was their starting point in terms of the negotiations. The open secret that these were facilities being built far underground in order to seek to render them impenetrable to Israeli and US action. And all of this, of course, is inevitably something that needs to be taken together with the continuous threats by the Islamic regime in Iran to wipe off the map both the little Satan Israel and the big Satan America. So if you want to take it through those sort of layers of analysis, then you can, but if you're looking for a quick answer, then the ongoing armed conflict between Israel and Iran means that these strikes are self-evidently legal. The notion that you would need UN Security Council resolution blessing to act in self-defense in this fashion is ludicrous. And I do think that one of the real concerns is that this sort of rhetoric, this sort of misinformation, weaponization, inversion, and abuse of international law is rendering the whole system of international law and the international legal order extremely fragile. And I think that's a problem for all countries that care about the rule of law and all individuals, I suppose, that care about law also.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to ask you, really. Have the last few years made international law look an arse, really? Like, you've got Israel trying to keep to international law against a terrorist organization that's doing everything to put its own civilians at risk. And then you've got things like the ICC deciding to kind of announce that Netanyahu is a war criminal, even though there are all the stuff, the Israel's not even a member of it, plus the fact it's a democratic country. And then you've got people arguing basically for terrorist organizations. So how does that make you feel, really, as an international lawyer and in the way it's being misused?
I mean, extremely concerned would be an understatement. Deeply frustrated, likewise. But can I just tell you a little bit about the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and these supposed arrest warrants? I mean, this is a court that, as you intimated, works on the basis of the member states that have signed up to the court giving the court jurisdiction. And jurisdiction is key because it's what separates a court from just another political body. And what happens is that the states that have signed up to the ICC, they delegate their own domestic jurisdiction to the court for the purpose of investigating and prosecuting any serious war crimes. Now, neither Israel nor the US joined the ICC, and for good reason, because it was clear even at the drafting of the Rome Statute, which founded the court, that this was going to be a court that was going to be used for political purposes against Israel. Absent jurisdiction, this court has no business investigating supposed alleged war crimes on the territory of the State of Israel. The way that they sought to circumvent this already in 2020 and 2021 was by supposedly recognizing a state of Palestine, a non-existent state of Palestine, and saying, well, that gives us sufficient territorial jurisdiction. But they have gone further still and sought to investigate Israeli conduct on Israeli territory proper. Whichever way you look at it, this is a court that has thrown jurisdiction out of the window. And that is fundamental problem number one with its approach with respect to Israeli leaders.
Its own rules.
Completely breaking its own rules. It's also breaking its own rules, one of the fundamental rules of the court, which is called complementarity. This is a court that was established to complement domestic jurisdictions, not to replace them. So when you talk about Israel as a democracy, Israel is a country of law and order. And even if you ignore the fact that it's not a member, this court is mandated to allow Israel an opportunity to investigate and prosecute any alleged crimes itself, and it did not do that. On the contrary, the timing of the announcement of this arrest warrant application was very interesting, because it was the very day that court officials were supposed to meet Israeli officials to discuss that concern, so that Israel would have an opportunity to investigate. So that rule was thrown out of the window too. And then we come to the actual content of the arrest warrant application. Now, normally arrest warrants are applied for in secret, so that the individuals that are subject to them, and it's important to note that this is a court that looks at individuals rather than states, individual, but alleged war criminals, so that the individuals don't know that they're subject to an arrest warrant application and they travel internationally and they might get picked up somewhere. These arrest warrants have always been applied for in secret. Not so here. Karim Khan issues a public summary of his application. There's a press conference, a press release. He does an interview on Christian Amanpour. Totally unprecedented. But it did mean that UK LFI were able to go through his public summary of his arrest warrant application. And line by line, we demonstrated to the court and the public that every phrase of every sentence of that application was false. I'm not exaggerating. This allegation was predicated on the canard of starvation. And if anyone's been through, UK Lawyers for Israel publications, you will have seen our detailed analysis of IPC famine reports predicting starvation in Gaza, which never materialized, and how this was all predicated on false data. But even if you don't look at the detail of that, this is clearly refutable on the basis of publicly available information published by COGAT, which is the unit of the Israeli Defense Forces that its sole responsibility is to provide for the local civilian population in times of armed conflict. And they, throughout this war, have published on their website the volume of aid going into the Gaza Strip. So not only was it just, every phrase of every sentence was palpably false, but it was very easily provably false with a Google search. Karim Khan's response to our submission was to tell the court to ignore any submissions on accuracy that did not come from him. And of course, you know how the story continued, and the court was persuaded, and I would say misled, on the basis of that false information to issue these arrest warrants. That is, part and parcel of the farcical nature of many of these international proceedings. And I come back to this same point, but this is not just Israel's problem. And when I travel internationally and I'm speaking to politicians and policymakers, that is my main message. Even if you don't care two straws about Israel, this is reminiscent. This is a manifestation of a much bigger battle. And it's one that has been going for decades between rule of law countries like the UK, the US, Israel, most of Europe, rule of law countries that view law as a curtailment on government power, against the despots and dictatorships of this world that view law as a means of wielding power. And we've seen that struggle, that tension play out over decades through, how international conventions are being negotiated between parties. But we are seeing the manifestations of this now in the way that international courts, tribunals, and other international organizations are being taken over and are being used for these political purposes. And what starts with Israel and what starts with the Jews is not going to end with the Jews. So I do think that it's something that everyone needs to sit up and take notice of. But it's absolutely true that international law is being trashed. I think increasingly in the last few weeks, especially with respect to the big debate about, are the Iran strikes legal, I don't get on much anymore. For some reason, BBC and Sky don't like what I have to say. So I have seen this vacuum in the way that the media is discussing this, of anyone talking about the real international law here and the way that it applies. But what I have seen are people that clearly have some sort of instinctive problem with the notion that Israel and America wouldn't be able to strike back at the world's foremost state sponsor of terror and save the free world in this fashion. Instinctively, they feel that there is something wrong with, you know, the intellectual liberal elite saying that this is illegal. And so their response to it is to say, well, international law isn't us, clearly. And that's a problem for me because I know that it's not true. And I know that's not what international law says or mandates. And so I lament it on two levels, in a sense, because of that. So, you know, I feel re-energized and recommitted to the fight and educating as many people as possible as to what real international law says.
Thank you. Well, let's talk a bit about Sky and BBC maybe, and some of the fun you've had on those shows. And you know, I suppose what would be nice would be to think that we could sue someone like James O'Brien, not on those shows, but but
he refuses to have me on, by the way. Just
yeah,
you know,
same. And similarly, like Matthew Wright, I used to know, and now he blocks me. So I suppose it's two things. Firstly, having someone who knows what they're talking about on, and the fact that they don't. But also, some of the stuff that they say, is it suable?
So unfortunately not, for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, we have free press here, and I think that the main way that you fight misinformation is with real information. The challenge is, how do you get that out there? I'm now on X. I'm trying. I mean, you're a wonder with that sort of thing. I think it comes easily to journalists. I don't know. I've struggled a little bit with it, but I'm applying myself. But the other aspect of this is, if you were to tell these kind of lies about a person, they would sue you in defamation. You cannot defame a state or the institutions of a state. And therefore, they are able to get away with murder, ultimately, in terms of the false allegations that they simply repeat against Israel. I'll give you one example from right at the beginning of the war, which I know everyone will be familiar with, which is the Al-Ali hospital strike. This allegation that Israel had conducted an airstrike on the Al-Ali hospital and that 500 casualties had resulted. So I was supposed to be on the BBC as this story was breaking, in no small part thanks to Neil Blair, your brother Jonathan, who was, you know, fighting my corner with these channels when they were talking about international law, and they didn't have anyone who knew about international law on. So I'm very grateful for his pushes. But I was waiting on the line when I had a call from the deputy editor of the channel. I'm so sorry, Natasha. We're going to have to bump you again, the third time that week, to run with this breaking news. We've got this, you know, rolling coverage of the hospital strike. I said, what are you talking about? Now more than ever you need me on, because I'm watching your breaking news and commentator after commentator calling this an Israeli airstrike. I said, I'm already looking at reports online that this was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that fell short. I've not seen that on any of the wires. That was his response. I said, okay, but the fact of the matter is, at this stage, we don't know who or what has hit that hospital. We do know that PIJ rockets and Hamas rockets routinely fall short in the Gaza Strip. In the last exchange between Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Israel in 2021, a third of their rockets fell short in Gaza. And when they don't fall according to a proportionality analysis. They don't fall targeted on military sites. They fall and they kill indiscriminately. And we know that Hamas keeps weapons caches next to hospitals and schools and mosques. And as I was going through, you know, the things that we know and the things that we don't know, he put the phone down on me. There is absolutely no desire amongst these journalists, I don't know if you can even call them that anymore, to report accurately when there's an option to frankly do the dirty on Israel. And my dear old friend, Douglas Murray, told me that when he was embedded with the IDF in Lebanon, he was there with a number of other international journalists who were very open about the fact that they needed to be very careful about what they said in their reports because of Hezbollah and what Hezbollah would do to their colleagues in Beirut if they said the wrong thing. So this abject absence of journalistic integrity, I'm sorry, present company excluded,
No,
which infects reporting from across the region and has been the work of frankly decades. If anyone's familiar with Matti Friedman, he wrote about 20 years ago a series of essays about his experiences in the Associated Press in Jerusalem and how the editorial lines worked and what they reported. And he more recently came out and did an interview where he said, I believe that I was present for the first instance of the exercise of Hamas censorship on reports. It was to do with Hamas's use of basically civilians as human shields and dressing as civilians very early on in its conflict with Israel. And he had received a call from the reporter who had written the piece, who said that needed to come out. And Matti reports that speaking to this gentleman on the phone, he knew from the tone of the voice of the reporter that it was a matter of life and death, and that that had to be exercised. And Matti Friedman's suggestion to his editor was that they include a note that it had been subject to censorship by Hamas and he was overruled. I would expect that if responsible journalists were reporting from North Korea, there would be some sort of, tagline, we are not free to report without censorship. In fact, we've seen so many reports now from Iran, from journalists going into Iran, that haven't included that either, that they are not free to report without censorship from that country. And the absence of this from any reporting from the region is truly lamentable. But I don't think it takes much appreciation and knowledge of how that part of the world works to understand that you really, really need to take what is being said by news broadcasters, print journalists, with an enormous helping of salt when you understand the constraints that they are operating under there.
I suppose actually for the last 2 years we've seen both of our professions being tarnished by what's happened. It's kind of lifted a lid as to what's going on.
Well, let's be fair, everyone always hated lawyers. So
yeah, and journalists. And on that note, I'm going to open it up to the audience. I presume that there's probably some microphones going around, lots of hands already. Let's start with one in the front here. Well, I'll start with one question at a time and we'll see how we go. There's a man here just on the front. And then if you put your hands up so I can get a microphone too, and then I'll do one at the back there because I think there's somebody with a microphone there. There's someone with their hand. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. It's been fascinating. I want to start with David Miller. I want to know what legal instruments we can use to fight the fact that anti-Zionism is now a protected belief. I know, Natasha, you've said in the past, well, that means Zionism is a protected belief too. I don't think that's good enough. Not attacking you, but I'm just saying that I think that it is not enough in law now to have constant hate of perhaps 90 to 95% of the Jews in this country. What do we do?
It's a really good question, and I'm not sure that there is a sensible answer to it. And we've seen the impact of this, of course, Zoe Strimple, who has just revealed the Margate, blatantly anti-Semitic art exhibition, and her report on X was that her complaint to police was rejected because they said, no, it's not anti-Semitic, it's just anti-Israel and it's criticism of the Jewish state. So that's extremely problematic. I would highlight, though, that one of the big problems in getting across this message that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, it is a modern subset of anti-Semitism, it is, if you will, the modern acceptable face of anti-Semitism, but it is anti-Semitic, is the fact that you have many prominent Jews saying that it isn't. Now, a couple of years ago, again, with Douglas, did quite a well-publicised debate against Mehdi Hassan and Gideon Levy, in which we won on the motion that anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism. And I think that was for good reason, because when you make an exception for Israel, when you single the Jewish state out and say, I am anti-Zionist, unless you're some sort of hermit who doesn't believe in nation states as a whole, and I've yet to meet an anti-Zionist who fits that description, then you are bigoted, you are anti-Semitic, you are making an exception for the Jewish state and the Jews. And that is a message that I hope that we can be getting out so strongly that it's drowning out those voices, even if they're coming from ostensibly the Jewish community saying the opposite. I really think that that's the only potential avenue to seek to right this wrong of this distinction that they're seeking to draw, because that is ultimately what is proving impossible to navigate. Now, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism goes a very long way. It's not a legally enforceable definition. It's there to be able to help people to identify what anti-Semitism is. It goes a very long way by giving a list of examples to illustrate aspects of anti-Zionism that are blatantly anti-Semitic. But even that has been under threat and under constant attack, including, I'm sorry to say, from members of the Jewish community. And you may also be familiar, thankfully it sort of died out, but this Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism that was raised about 5 years ago as a counter to the IHRA definition, which sought to re-establish this non-existent distinction between them. So that's critical. The reason, I hope you don't think my remark was flippant when I said, well, if anti-Zionism is a protected characteristic, so is Zionism. That's the decision of the employment tribunal in that case. It's one of the reasons, actually, I said at the beginning that letter writing is more effective than litigating. Often when you litigate, there is a risk that you end up setting a precedent which is unhelpful to you. No litigation is without risk. Any lawyer will tell you that the only people who are dead set to benefit from litigation are the lawyers, right? So that's tricky. And even challenging that, and I know that there's some discussion potentially of an appeal, and I have to confess I haven't been following closely enough what's happening. The danger of that is what is a non-binding employment tribunal decision might then, be reaffirmed at a more authoritative level at the appeal tribunal. So I do think that it is a case of educating the politicians, as opposed to using legal instruments, which I'm afraid to say in this particular instance are really blunt. One of the things I spent a lot of time doing over the last 2.5 years is liaising with the police, the Metropolitan Police in particular. They were kind enough actually to take me on a ride along on one of the big hate marches to seek to demonstrate some of the things that they were putting into practice. I know that they're under a lot of pressure, but it's simply not good enough. And I do not blame the ordinary police officers at all. And frankly, it's difficult to blame the sort of middling to senior police officers. An awful lot of this is in terms of policy is coming from the top. But I do think that in that context, it's about educating, and it's about relentlessly making those representations. And as worrying and traumatic in so many respects as the deteriorating situation is, one can only hope that it is opening the eyes of these individuals to the reality of what it is we are grappling with, because we are witnessing the globalizing of the Intifada. We are witnessing what it means to use Zionist as an expression, to target Jews. And just the last thing I would say on this, as a little bit of an aside, is that lots of people, oh my goodness, I even had this discussion with Charlie Kirk very shortly before he was so tragically assassinated. But how does one know when, supposed criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic when it's untrue? Blood libels against the Jewish state are not criticism of the state of Israel. And the IHRA definition helps to a certain extent in identifying some of these examples, but frankly, I think it's been taken over by the extent of the blood libels that are now pervasive against the Jewish state. But to the extent that you are supposedly putting forward criticism that is based on falsehood, that is not legitimate criticism. That is anti-Semitism.
Great answer, thank you. So we've got someone over there with a microphone.
Thank you. Natasha, I follow you on X, and I love everything you do.
I know I need to post more.
No, you do. And you always like a post, which I think is automatic, correct? Because even at 3 in the morning, you do that.
Yeah.
Anyway, in terms of education, I think it's just so difficult. It is so hard. And I grapple with that myself. I think, how can we educate? I have loads of discussions with people, but they're so manipulated. And I mean, I think the media has blood on their hand. BBC and Sky News and Yalda Hakim, I'm going to call her out. They have blood on their, on their hands. You see it now even with Iran. It's just a downward spiral. So I just wondered what you think, how we as individuals, I know you think about letter writing to everyone, but I mean, there must be other ways to try and educate people that are so far gone.
I mean, just to endorse what you're saying on a very practical level, I mentioned the Al Ahly hospital incident. Of course, when that full story went around the world, there were riots in the Middle East, and people were killed as a result. So I unfortunately, you are absolutely right, even in that one instance of the BBC and others having blood on their hands. But of course, what we have seen in this avalanche of anti-Semitism is, I mean, we can all see the direct correlation between that and the false reporting, which has spurred it on. I mean, I'm always open to suggestions and ideas, and I know you're all coming from so many different, walks of life and careers and backgrounds and industries. Frankly, the media side of things has been a real learning curve for me. And I naively, at the start of this process, when I was having these frantic conversations with Neil, I was like, why can't I get on anywhere? I naively thought, surely these broadcasters would want to have the other perspective, if you will, a debate of sorts, some sort of reflection of balance or both-sidedness or anything like that. Surely they would welcome that, and I can at least contribute that, and in the process, hopefully, win through with reason and logic and facts. And I quite quickly found out that I was naive about that. There is absolutely no desire to hear the reality of the situation if it so conflicts with the agenda and the, frankly, the propaganda that they have been spewing for so long. And I saw that was so palpable in every experience I had on the BBC. I mean, the first time was with, bless her, Katya Adler. And I felt a little bit bad for her because I think that she had been dropped in it potentially a little bit. She had given such a long plethora of allegations against Israel very early on in the conflict that I felt, unlike the standard, you're supposed to give a short answer and then allow, I know, in terms of journalistic back and forth, and then allow them to come back. She had gone for such a shopping list of allegations. And I said, well, let me answer those each in turn. And I did. And at some point, as I was continuing with my explanation and my response to each of these shopping list of items, there was clearly someone screaming in her ear, shut her up now, because all she was saying, Natasha Hausdorff, you've said a lot from your perspective, Natasha Hausdorff, and then there was nothing else coming. And then since then, I was told that they were trying to put me on with someone who could deal with me. Those were the words. And there were a number of different experiences I had with Christian Fraser where he was clearly trying to catch me out and he wasn't able to on this, so he moved to this subject and this. And at the end of one of our exchanges, he sort of exasperatedly said, it's always good to debate with you, Natasha. And I just thought, well, what other contributor are they inviting on I would have hoped to learn from in terms of, the international law on this? Are they inviting on to debate with? I don't mind. But the problem is when they lost the debate, I was never coming on again. So that is a dynamic that I have, frankly, found quite difficult to navigate. And if anyone has any ideas, I'm all ears, because I've always tried to be polite and engaging with the questions, and there to assist as much as I possibly can. And they never seem to like me very much. So that's actually, a dynamic that I have found very, very difficult to navigate, and frankly, very difficult to get airtime. To the extent that anyone has any thoughts on that, I'm all ears. But other than that, consistent complaints, writing op-eds, writing letters to the press. I know that there are some members of the community that do this on a regular basis. I think it does have an impact. If nothing else, it indicates to everyone else here and in many other rooms around the country that they're not alone. And I think that is as important as seeking, to persuade right-thinking people who might be a bit less informed.
Okay, gosh, there's so many. Okay, one here, one over there.
I'll keep my answers
and then
a
I will
bit
do
shorter,
some at the
sorry.
back as well. And there's one in the front here as well. I want to get. We'll do two at a time because there's so many people with questions.
Hi, can I jump in? Thank you, Natasha. It was very, very interesting. I want to pick on something you mentioned earlier around the state of Palestine. I know you mentioned this is one of your videos online. I can't remember which one. The PLO has been very successful in establishing this concept of the occupation. How much of it is true? What can Israel do to at least explain the realities and the truth around the occupation, the occupied territories, West Bank and all that?
So occupation is a legal term, and it is completely misplaced here and completely untrue. My position would be a better description of these territories, and we're talking about Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, is disputed territories. But actually, if you're looking at the proper application of international law, then according to universally applied international law and the customary rule of uti possidetis juris, don't know if anyone here has heard me talk about that before, possibly. I don't know if anyone here hasn't heard that before, but...
I ask anyone else if they can say it.
I still want to get T-shirts made so that, it rolls off the tongue. But according to uti possidetis juris, the borders of Israel from 1948 until today, because they remain unchanged, incorporated East Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and Gaza. I mean, there's an argument as to whether the 2005 withdrawal was an abandonment of that territory. But so far as East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria or the West Bank are concerned, there isn't that argument, because all that has happened since, throughout the peace negotiations, the Oslo Accords, the creation of areas A, B, and C, are that Israeli administration has been maintained in Area C, and the Palestinians have been given self-determination in areas A and B. So occupation is another canard here. If you will, it's a modern blood libel, just like ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and now genocide. These are legal terms that are being inverted and abused to seek to demonize Israel. And I think one of the things that is really troubling to me is I recall hearing Alan Dershowitz speaking something like 20 years ago about the term occupation. And he said, look, when people first started using it, we didn't push back. We knew it was untrue. But we didn't, he said, 20 years ago. It's too late because everybody says it's occupation now. Everybody says I don't accept. Everybody says it's not how you run a legal system. It's how people run lynches. Everybody says, get that person, right? So I never think it's too late to push back against something that is untrue. We absolutely need to be challenging this incorrect legal terminology and the incorrect application of international law, because it underlines everything that they claim that Israel is doing that is illegal. Illegal occupation is one of these buzzwords, and it's so easy to challenge if you know a little bit about the applicable international law. But you're right, it is part of this propaganda, this misinformation campaign that Yasser Arafat began and the PLO have consistently been so successful in because they're partners in this.
Can I just ask, how has that changed at all since we recognise the state of Palestine?
Well, no, because you cannot recognise something that is not a state. And actually, if you look at what the UK has said, what Keir Starmer has said, is that this is why it's completely nonsensical. But the UK has said that its recognition of the so-called non-existent state of Palestine is aspirational. And it reaffirmed that with its vote for the Security Council resolution that endorsed President Trump's peace plan that said something, I'm going to misquote it now, but it was, if I'm paraphrasing, it's something along the lines of, possibly there's a process, if the Palestinians cooperate, that there may be one day something that leads to self-determination and possibly even statehood for the Palestinians, right? That is not recognition of a non-existent state of Palestine. That is, wordsmithery. But the UK's vote in that Security Council resolution underpins that there isn't a state at the moment. And you cannot recognize a non-existent state that doesn't have a defined territory. So in fact, this cannot of occupation and this cannot of, there being a Palestinian state are inextricably linked, because under the Montevideo Convention, which sets out the required criteria for statehood, you need a defined territory, you need a permanent population, a government, and capacity to enter into international relations. And I would argue that the Palestinian Authority plus or minus Hamas, whichever way you want to look at it, doesn't fulfill any of those criteria, especially not when you have supposedly two governments and when the Palestinian Authority has only ever controlled territory in accordance with international agreements which make it clear that borders, and therefore statehood, will always be a final status negotiation issue, which we haven't got to yet. And when you take into account also the repeated repudiatory breaches of the Oslo Accords, the one prerequisite requirement for the PA was to renounce terrorism. And what followed the Oslo Accords? The Second Intifada. So what are we even talking about here? Sorry.
Thank you.
So much for shorter answers.
There was a question. Someone's got the microphone, haven't they? Yeah.
Can I continue? I recently attended a talk in town given by a British UN-type diplomat to an audience of a large audience of bigwigs, diplomats, so forth. And the talk was entitled International Law in the Age of Trump. He talked about a number of things, but in it he also accused Israel of genocide more than once and war crimes. Wasn't disputed, there were no questions from anybody there that was disputing what he was saying. Just recently, former diplomat Edmund Fitton-Brown has argued that the Foreign Office has been taken over, Islamified, against Britain's interest. Do you have a view on how this has happened?
There are a number of factors that have contributed to it, in my opinion. And it's not just the Foreign Office. We have seen this across international institutions, the United Nations, of course, championed by NGOs. When you ask how this has happened, let me give you one example that I think illustrates the process. I was asked to come and debate Amnesty International in Oslo and in Copenhagen about their report accusing Israel of genocide. Now, apart from the fact that the two individuals from the organisation that had been put up to debate me had plainly not read the report, I had, and in particular, I focused at the very beginning on the methodology section of the report. That made it clear that the organisation didn't have people on the ground in Gaza. They relied instead on local government authorities. Hamas. So Amnesty International takes Hamas propaganda, sticks it in a document headed up with its logo, and sends it out into the ether. That's picked up by Francesca Albanese and friends, by the UN Human Rights Council, and the Commission of Inquiry that basically copy and pasted that report into their report alleging genocide. That gets cited by the UN General Assembly, and it gets cycled into the International Court of Justice judgments or orders, and the protestations of the ICC. And then at that point, Amnesty and others say, see, the ICJ says so. And that cycle of disinformation is complete. And this is what has been happening for years. And it has been permeating through that international cyclical, disinformation laundering facility into not just the British Foreign Office, the FCDO, but I have heard this from the Australians when I sat down with them in Canberra. In fact, when they said, as a matter of international law, X, Y, Z, and I sought to address those issues, I got told, we're not here to talk about the law. This is our position as a matter of policy. So, the goalposts, of course, keep shifting. But international law as a buzzword is being deployed by these people, most of whom don't know the first thing about it, to justify their positions. And we've seen this, of course, repeatedly from the current Attorney General and the current Prime Minister. But that is very much backed up by the Foreign Office. And certainly my understanding is that previous governments had a very difficult time in navigating the civil service on these issues because, there has been, I agree with everything that I've seen, this sort of takeover, but it mirrors the takeover that we've seen in the academy, the International Legal Academy. If you have not drunk the Kool-Aid on Israel, you are not advancing in an academic career. You're definitely not getting tenure. And that process then sort of weeds out any opposition. So when I say there are many factors at play here, in many senses it has become a perfect storm. But ultimately, I think the chink in the armor is that it's very easy to prove wrong. Genocide, are you kidding? Look at the statistics for starters. But then also, I think it's helpful to understand how a canard like that really comes into existence. And ultimately, I believe it is all projection. Whatever the Jews are accused of, it is what has been done to them. And so it is not by coincidence that the term genocide, which was coined by Raphael Lemkin in the aftermath of the Holocaust to provide this legal terminology to the Jewish experience of being targeted for extermination because they were Jews, is now being weaponized against the Jewish state. And it is also an inversion, of course, of what happened on the 7th of October, which were acts of genocide perpetrated by Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Fatah, other Palestinian terrorist groups, and supposedly ordinary Palestinian civilians that were targeting Jews because they were Jews for rape, torture, mutilation, and extermination. And for that then to be inverted and projected on the Jews is just part and parcel of everything that we are seeing the Jews being accused of, the real victims of these crimes, being accused of perpetrating them. I do think that the truth will out when there are sufficient voices to project it. And I'll just give one very, quick, short example on this, because there's so much to say on these issues. I had the great privilege of going into Gaza in September 2024 with a group of expert military, very high-ranking military, some of them retired officers from 6 NATO states, including a gentleman I still have a lot of respect for, Sir John McCall, who I believe is also a member of the Queen's House. Look him up. He's got many accolades. Now, he arrived in Israel very unconvinced. Thought everything was desperately disproportionate. And he left having done a total 180. I've never seen rules of engagement like this. I've never seen a military take these sorts of measures to prevent civilian casualties. And he wrote 2 excellent op-eds when he came back. This is what I learned about what Israel is doing. And it's completely the opposite of anything that is approaching genocide, of course. And he came under the most vicious attack from what seemed to be every one of his former colleagues as a result of what he had written. And he hasn't written a word since. And that is the tragedy, that even those who know better, for reasons that I can understand but do not agree with, are being intimidated, harassed, abused. And if it's not important enough for them, it's not their fight. Why should they put their heads up above the parapet? So providing that support, and one of the things that I'm seeking to do is start an organization in the US called the Center for International Rule of Law, to provide a support network to those people who are professionals in the military, in law, in the academy, who get it and who feel sufficiently compelled to write about it, to speak about it, to provide that support network so they know they're not alone. And so that the next John McCall won't be so easily silenced. I hope that that's something that's feasible.
It's chilling that someone who's obviously senior military and so very brave has been cowed. I'll go for 2 questions towards the back. So there's a man in the middle with a hand straight, and then there's a lady at the back there. And someone at the back there.
Thank you very much for this evening. Natasha, you know these people at the BBC and Sky News. What do you think motivates them? Is it ignorance or is it anti-Semitism?
So, okay, another story. I don't know if it's going to assist very much with answering that question, but I was in a social setting, on a social occasion. I was introduced to a very senior journalist at the BBC who clearly, didn't know who I was or what I, said, because he was very nice to me to start off with. And we were getting on, charmingly. And then I started talking a little bit about the work of UK Lawyers for Israel and the famine review reports that we were doing that demonstrated that all of this was overblown and the projections were false. And I could tell that he was only sort of half listening, but at some point he cottoned on and he sort of turned to me and said, "But surely you accept Israel has been deliberately starving the Palestinians?" And when I sort of slightly exasperated said, "Well, no, because of everything that I've just been explaining," frankly, the look on his face, it was as though I had called his mother a woman of questionable virtue. It was so beyond the pale that I would question what everybody knows, which is supposedly that Israel is starving civilians, that he wasn't even able to entertain what it was I was sending. Now, he'd already given me his contact information, so I did dutifully, as I'd promised, email him all of the reports that I was talking about. Do you think I got a response? Of course not. So make of that what you will. I think that when I'm engaging with bookers, so many of the bookers for going on to do interviews, so many of them are so young that I think they're getting their history, their politics, their current affairs information from TikTok. I think ignorance plays such a significant role, but ultimately one of the biggest problems is the culture and the narrative and this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that if you can't blame Israel, then it's not news. And I remember I was living in Israel in 2016 during the so-called knife intifada. I remember watching, I think it was a Sky News report, but don't quote me on that, where there was a terrorist who had been neutralized and who was ultimately, I can't remember if he was still visible, probably wasn't visible behind, but the attack weapon was visible in shot and in the footage that they were playing. And the broadcaster, or the reporter that was giving the update said, without batting an eyelid, that this was an unarmed attacker that had been shot. And you think, how ridiculous do you look right now? But what are the consequences to that? Jeremy Bowen said he wasn't sorry about the Al-Akhli false reporting, despite the horrendous consequences that it had. He wasn't sorry. And I don't think many of them are sorry. So make of that what you will. Is it some, inherent bias against the Jews that we correctly call anti-Semitism? Is it something that, no one's going to put their head up above the parapet because you're just not going to get ahead in that profession? And when, Jeremy Bowen is training the next cadre of journalists that go and report from the Middle East, well, certainly this isn't going to get any better, is it?
And there's someone at the back there who's hopefully got a microphone. The lady there.
Nicole and Natasha, thank you for everything you're doing. It's incredible and it's really breathtaking and needed more now than ever. Natasha, can you tell us, please, about any work UK LFI is engaged in to counter the deep toxicity that exists within academia nationwide? There's a direct correlation, undoubtedly, between that and incitement to anti-Semitism amongst the most impressionable people in the country. one of our children is studying international relations at university, and she sends us audio clips in real time of the incredibly one-sided lies, which result in her being shouted at as being a murderer. As a young, impressionable, fresh-faced 19-year-old, you can't stand up to a 70-year-old lecturer. But yeah, tell me about academia and what can be done.
That is what we're here for. So I'm really pleased that we have relatively recently been able to take on a dedicated staff member specifically for education, schools and universities. And we deal with students that come to us either directly or through organizations like Stand With Us, Camera, the Union of Jewish Students and various other JSOCs and Hillels with exactly these sorts of examples. Schools is another question altogether, and we have been very active on seeking to combat. Frankly, I mean, these are breaches of the law when teachers are bringing politics, very one-sided narratives into the classroom. Unfortunately, there are also organizations that are being endorsed by the Jewish community and by Jewish communal bodies to teach the conflict that are deeply, deeply flawed in their approaches to this, and it's something that we have struggled to contend with. And to the extent that any of you know any students that are facing these difficulties, that have this sort of evidence, many bring us recordings. We then have to navigate, to what extent students are permitted to record, but we do have a lot of experience in that. And unfortunately, it is something that just has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. But the fact that UKLFI exists, the fact that Stand With Us exists, and all of these other organisations that didn't exist when I was at university means that none of these students should feel alone or overwhelmed or unable to contend with these issues. We have successfully represented students in challenges where they have been marked down for reasons that, they didn't blame everything going wrong in the Middle East against Israel. Or blame Israel for that. And we, again, I mean, it is really on a case-by-case basis, but always happy to pick up individual instances and make representations, be it to university governance bodies, based on the university rulebook and the standards that they set for themselves, or liaising a lot with vice chancellors of universities. And there are increasingly groups of academics that we are liaising with to seek to provide that support to staff members as well as students. So that is a huge part of the work that is ever increasing, and that we definitely need to grow our ranks to be able to deal with the volume. And I said it was, multiples of it. Well, so the Jonathan and Caroline Turner, who are tirelessly running this organization, estimate that the workload has increased over 20%. We have not increased our staff capacity nearly as much as that, but we definitely need to get better at fundraising and growing and providing this resource to as many people as possible. It has always been a responsive organization. So when I got involved as a student in 2010, it was a very, very different kettle of fish. It's been a voluntary organization of lawyers, and we have essentially developed expertise in so many of these different areas through responding to individuals coming to us with each of these different complaints and difficulties and challenges. So we're very committed to growing, to continuing to be there for the community in all of these different areas.
I'm really sorry, but it's time to end. I know you probably all have loads of questions for Natasha, but it seems like a good time as well, because it's a positive story about UKLFI, and because I work closely with them, I see the difference that they make. Even just, I've seen the letter that they've helped Zoe write about that anti-Semitic artwork that's going out in the next few days. So thank you very much. Thank you to the Blair family for hosting this. And thank you very much to JW3. I think, Ray, you're coming on, aren't you?
Usually when we get to an end of an evening with some great speakers, I like to try and give a bit of a summary, sort of share some reflections of what I've heard, but they covered so much ground, and really how articulate and how fortunate are we to have two phenomenal women like this who represent us in the community. So first of all, I just want to say a thank you to Natasha and Nicole for such a thoughtful and compelling conversation. We could have sat here for hours, so thank you. To the wonderful Cynthia and to Neil and Jonathan for your continued support of JW3 and for allowing us to honour Dennis in this way every year. And I think you'll agree he would have loved this conversation this evening. He would have never let either of you go home. And a real thank you to all of you for being here tonight at a time where it might just be easier to stay at home and hide under the duvet rather than coming out and showing up in Jewish spaces, which is what I think we have to do. And I said at the start of my introduction that spaces like JW3 matter now more than ever. And I meant that literally. We've seen in the past few weeks that people in our community and beyond need a space to come together in community, to be with community, in safe, welcoming homes for unashamedly Jewish conversations. And we have to do that. Now is not the time to dial the volume down. Now's the time to dial the volume up. And I've got to tell you, folks, we don't normally end any event in this way, but I just want to be really honest with you. And I've been doing the rounds. I don't usually do the kind of rounds of TV and radio that both of you do, but over the last few days, I feel like I've just been on a non-stop merry-go-round, and I'm sorry, those of you that are nodding, that you've had to see this face every time you turn on the TV. But a message that's been so important to explain, and we're explaining it when we meet with government ministers or whether it's journalists, is that there's no community centre or cultural venue in the entire country that has to spend what we now have to spend on security. Right? Around £600,000 of the money we raise goes straight out on security. And if we didn't do it, not because they're being paid a fortune, our security officers, but without that, we wouldn't be able to open our doors. Imagine we had that money to be able to spend on our activities, on our free activities for Holocaust survivors, and for our activities in arts and culture and community and social action and our food bank. But that money goes straight out on security because we have the word Jewish proudly emblazoned on our building, and we won't take that down. So that's just the reality that we're operating in now. Every pound we spend on security is a pound that we can't spend on our programming. So if you believe in what JW3 stands for, if you're ever able to support us in any way, and I know you paid for your tickets tonight, if you're ever able to, there's a QR code on the screen. I will allow you to get your phones out for this bit. This isn't any kind of hard-hitting appeal. If you're able to make a contribution, and many of you already do, please do, and look out for the appeals that we run during the year, because actually, without places like this, what's the fight for, right? We have to fight so that we can have vibrant Jewish life, and we're part of that. So I'm now going to ask you to do one last thing. We're going to give Nicole and Natasha a chance, if they want, to get off the stage and to go backstage rather than necessarily being mobbed. If they want to stay, they can, but I know they've also got other places to go to. And your invitation is to continue the conversation. They triggered the conversation that you now want to have. And the cafe and the bar are open there if you want to continue having it there with somebody you know or somebody you've only just met. Continue those conversations. But whenever it is that you leave, whether it's now or whether it's after you've had a glass of wine, please remember on your way out to just thank the security officers, because they're here day and night looking after us. So just remember any Jewish women. Thank you and good night.
A question that wasn't asked, which was the opinion that the government made about not allowing the US to use British bases. What was the legal basis for that? But Dermot's Irma's supposed to know all this stuff. It's bollocks. Sorry, beg your pardon. I'll let others get at you. One last question. Last night we should be able to talking about and how the council do anything.
Comforting.